He switched bodies every time he fell asleep, but couldn't get back. The dread wasn't in the falling asleep itself, it was in the waking. Every night, Leo Maxwell, a man of 34 whose life had become a perpetual waking nightmare, would drift off in one body and snap awake in another. He never knew whose. It wasn't a dream, it was his terrifying reality. The first shift. It started subtly, a strange disconnect that Leo, then a carefree 28-year-old software engineer, initially dismissed as a particularly vivid dream. He'd gone to sleep in his own bed, in his modest apartment in Mumbai, the city's familiar hum a lullaby outside his window. He'd woken up in a room that was definitely not his. The ceiling was higher, adorned with an ornate chandelier. The bed was a vast, four-poster affair, draped in heavy velvet. He'd blinked, rubbed his eyes, and thought, wow, that was a real one. Then he'd walked to the bathroom, and the face staring back from the mirror had sent a jolt of ice through him. It wasn't his face. This man was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and tired, deep-set eyes. Leo had touched his new face, his new body, with trembling hands. The skin felt alien, the movements clumsy. Panic, cold and sharp, had begun to bloom. He'd spent that first day in a daze, stumbling through a grand house he didn't recognize, trying to make sense of the strange clothes, the unfamiliar routines, the whispers of a housekeeper named Mrs. Sharma, who addressed him as Sir. He'd managed to find a mirror again, and confirmed the horrifying truth. He was not Leo Maxwell. Not in this body, anyway. When sleep had finally claimed him that night, exhaustion winning over terror, he'd woken up again. And again, it was a different body. This time, a young woman, perhaps 22, with long, dark hair and wide, expressive eyes. She lay in a cramped, brightly painted room filled with art supplies. Leo, trapped in this new skin, felt a surge of despair. A shifting existence. The pattern quickly became undeniable. Every time Leo fell asleep, he woke up in a new body. There was no rhyme or reason to it. He could be a robust 50-year-old one day, a frail octogenarian the next. Sometimes he was male, sometimes female. He inhabited bodies of different ethnicities, different social classes, different levels of health. He was a wealthy businessman one night, a struggling student another, a street vendor, a nurse, a child. The only constant was the terrifying uncertainty of who he would be when he opened his eyes. He tried everything to stop it. He tried staying awake, pushing himself to the brink of collapse with caffeine and sheer will. But eventually, sleep always won, dragging him down into the oblivion that preceded his next unwilling transformation. He tried to understand the rules. Was it random? Was there a pattern based on geography, or time, or anything at all? There seemed to be no logic. He could wake up in Mumbai, then Delhi, then a small village in Rajasthan, then suddenly in London, or New York, or a fishing boat off the coast of Kerala. The sheer disorientation was soul-crushing. He never knew names, relationships, or responsibilities. He had to piece together fragmented lives from clues in his surroundings, photographs, letters, conversations he overheard, the way people reacted to him. He learned to adapt quickly, to observe and mimic. He learned to play the part, to smile at strangers he supposedly knew, to nod intelligently to conversations he didn't understand, to perform tasks he had no prior knowledge of. It was a constant, exhausting performance. The worst part was the isolation. He was Leo Maxwell, but no one knew that. He couldn't explain his predicament. Who would believe him? He tried once, in the body of a young medical student named Rohan, to confess to Rohan's bewildered roommate. The roommate had just stared at him, then quietly suggested he might be overstressed. Leo never tried again. He was a ghost, haunting other people's lives, a silent observer in a world that was no longer his. He missed his old life with an ache that was almost physical. He missed his comfortable apartment, his familiar routine, his friends, his family. His parents, Sunita and Raj, both in their late 60s, would be worried sick, or worse, they might think he'd simply disappeared. The thought was a constant pang in his chest. He tried to find his own body, his own life. He would scan newspapers, watch television, search online, desperately hoping to see a missing person report that matched his own description. He never did. It was as if Leo Maxwell had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by this bizarre phenomenon. The search for a way back. Days bled into weeks, then months. Leo developed a strange set of skills. He became a master of improvisation, a chameleon of human experience. He learned to decipher clues rapidly, to understand social cues, to navigate unfamiliar environments with a strange kind of intuition. He learned snippets of dozens of languages, absorbed cultural norms from across the globe. He was living a million lives, but none of them were his own. He also started to actively search for a way back. He began to look for patterns, for anomalies. Were there certain types of bodies he never inhabited? Were there places that seemed to recur? He started keeping mental notes, a vast, chaotic database of experiences. He was constantly looking for something, anything, that might offer a clue, a loophole, a door back to his own skin. Sometimes, he would wake up in a body that was ill or in pain. He once spent 3 days in the body of an elderly woman suffering from a debilitating illness, the constant ache, a grinding torment. Another time, he inhabited the body of a child in a poverty-stricken village, the hunger a hollow, gnawing sensation. These experiences, though harrowing, also instilled in him a strange kind of empathy. He was living the full spectrum of human existence, from the highest highs of luxury to the lowest lows of suffering. He remembered a fleeting thought from his old life, a half-joking conversation with a friend about consciousness and quantum physics. Could this be some strange manifestation of that? A glitch in the fabric of reality? He had no answers, only a persistent, gnawing hope that if he understood the mechanism, he could reverse it. He tried to visit places he knew from his past, hoping proximity might trigger something. He'd wake up in Chennai, then manage to find a way to Mumbai, only to fall asleep and wake up in Paris. It was futile. The world was vast, and his movements were dictated by the random whims of sleep. Glimmers of connection. There were moments, rare and precious, when a sense of connection would pierce through the profound isolation. Once, he woke up as a young man named Aryan, working in a small bookstore in Bandra. He found himself inexplicably drawn to a particular poetry book, a collection of Rumi. As he read the verses, a strange feeling washed over him, a sense of peace he hadn't felt since his old life. It was a brief respite, a reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, even in a borrowed body. Another time, he woke as a kind elderly woman named Leela, who lived in a small, traditional house in a quiet part of Juhu. Her days were filled with simple joys, tending to her garden, cooking fragrant meals, listening to old Bollywood songs. For a day, Leo experienced a profound sense of calm, a gentle rhythm of life that was a stark contrast to his usual chaos. He found himself wishing he could stay, that this body, this life, could be his permanent refuge. But sleep always came. He started to wonder about the original inhabitants of these bodies. Where did they go when he was occupying their lives? Were they trapped in a similar limbo, displaced and bewildered? Or were they simply dormant, their consciousness suspended until he moved on? The thought was unsettling, adding another layer to his guilt and confusion. He was an uninvited guest, a silent thief of lives. The fading memory of himself. As the years passed, Leo's memory of his original self began to fray. The details of his apartment, the faces of his friends, even the exact sound of his parents' voices, they were becoming less distinct, like old photographs fading in the sun. He struggled to remember his own laugh, the way his own hands felt. He was losing himself, piece by painful piece, consumed by the countless identities he inhabited. He still clung to the name, Leo Maxwell. It was the only constant, the only tether to who he truly was. He would whisper it to himself in the quiet moments, a secret mantra in a borrowed voice. Leo Maxwell, he'd mouth, watching a stranger's lips form the words. The weariness became immense. The constant vigilance, the relentless performance, the profound loneliness, it took its toll. He was tired of living a million lives that weren't his. He craved the simple familiarity of his own skin, his own bed, his own ordinary life. He started noticing something else, a subtle change in the quality of the shifts. Sometimes, just before he drifted off, he would experience a fleeting sensation, like a faint echo of another consciousness. It was a fleeting whisper, a sensation of being somewhere else even before he truly landed. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, a new layer to the mystery. A desperate hypothesis. One night, he woke up in the body of a reclusive theoretical physicist named Drive. R.S. Thorne, a man of 55 with a brilliant, albeit eccentric, mind. He found himself surrounded by complex equations and esoteric texts. A flicker of hope ignited within him. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps this body held the key. Dr. Thorne's notes were dense, filled with concepts Leo could barely grasp: quantum entanglement, consciousness transfer, parallel universes. But as he immersed himself in the material, a desperate hypothesis began to form. What if his consciousness wasn't switching bodies in a linear sense, but rather slipping between parallel realities, each inhabited by a slightly different version of himself, or of someone else entirely? And what if the act of falling asleep was the trigger for this interdimensional drift? He spent the entire day in Dr. Thorne's study, frantically devouring information. He saw diagrams, theories, even speculative schematics for devices designed to manipulate consciousness. It was overwhelming, but within the complexity, he found a glimmer of possibility. What if he could deliberately influence the shift? What if there was a way to navigate back to his original reality, his original body? The theory he cobbled together, from fragmented notes and half-understood concepts, was this: his consciousness was an unbound entity, temporarily anchoring itself to a physical vessel upon waking. The act of sleep disrupted this anchor, allowing it to drift to another available vessel, in a different reality. To return, he needed to find a way to project his consciousness back to his starting point, to his home frequency. He focused on the idea of a home frequency. Every individual, every reality, must have a unique vibrational signature. If he could find his own, if he could somehow tune himself to it, maybe he could pull himself back. It was a desperate, almost nonsensical idea, but it was all he had. The last attempt. Sleep was an enemy, but it was also the only door. That night, as Leo, in the body of Dr. Thorne, felt the familiar pull of exhaustion, he tried something different. He closed his eyes and, with every fiber of his being, he concentrated on the fading memory of his own self, the feel of his own skin, the smell of his own apartment, the sound of his parents' voices calling his name. He visualized his old life with a desperate intensity, trying to mentally project his consciousness, like a homing beacon. He held on to the image of his bed, his pillow, the view from his window. He imagined the feeling of his own heartbeat, the rhythm of his own breath. He poured all his desperate hope into this single, focused intention. He had no idea if it would work, if any of Dr. Thorne's theories held a shred of truth that applied to his bizarre situation. But it was his last, best shot. He felt the familiar drift, the sensation of his consciousness detaching, spiraling into the void between realities. But this time, instead of feeling truly random, there was a faint pull, a subtle resistance, as if a thread were tugging him in a specific direction. He clung to that feeling, that faint tug, focusing all his mental energy on pulling himself along it. He didn't know how long he was in that void, that realm between waking and sleeping, between bodies. It felt like an eternity, a vast, silent ocean of possibilities. He held on to the image of his own life with an iron will, a desperate, silent plea to be returned. The unfamiliar familiar. Then, a jolt, not a gentle landing, but a sudden, jarring snap. He opened his eyes. The light was dim, familiar. The ceiling was lower, adorned with a simple, functional fan. The bed was a standard single, firm beneath him. He blinked, confusion battling with a nascent hope. He sat up, his heart pounding. The room was small, a bit cluttered, with a stack of technical books on a bedside table. It felt right, too right. He stumbled to the small mirror in the corner, holding his breath. He looked into it, and for a long moment, simply stared. Stared at the reflection of Leo Maxwell. 34 years old, a bit older, perhaps a few more lines around the eyes than he remembered, a faint shadow of a beard he should have shaved. But it was him, his face, his body. A wave of dizzying relief washed over him, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He touched his own face, traced the contours of his own jawline, felt the familiar texture of his own hair. It was real. He was back. He walked to the window, pulled back the curtains, and looked out. The familiar chaotic symphony of Mumbai unfolded before him. The distant honking of taxis, the murmur of street vendors, the faint smell of exhaust and spices. His apartment, his city, his life. He didn't know if he would ever sleep again. The terror of slipping away, of losing himself once more, was still a cold knot in his stomach. But for now, for this precious moment, he was home. He was Leo Maxwell, and the weight of 1,000 borrowed lives began to slowly, thankfully, lift. The memory of the journey would forever be etched into his soul, a silent testament to a world beyond comprehension.